Tonight, we open a vault that has remained sealed for over 70 years, a discovery so dangerous that the Vatican has spent decades ensuring most of the world never sees what was actually found. This is not about lost gospels or missing books. This is about something far more threatening. Evidence that everything we know about the origins of Christianity might be built on carefully constructed lies. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea. What echoed back would shake the foundations of faith itself. But by the time you hear this story tonight, you'll understand why that echo has been muffled, why those scrolls have been locked away, and why the Vatican fears these ancient texts more than any heresy they've ever faced. Like the video, subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change how you see every church, every sermon, every prayer you've ever heard. And once you know the truth about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can never unknow it. It was supposed to be just another day searching for a lost goat. Mohammed Adib, a young Bedouin shepherd, was scrambling across the cliffs near Qumran when he noticed a small opening in the rock face. Curious, he picked up a stone and threw it inside. Instead of the dull thud he expected, he heard something break, something that sounded like pottery. What he found when he crawled inside that cave would become the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Tall clay jars, some intact, others shattered on the cave floor, and inside those jars, wrapped in linen cloth that crumbled at his touch, were scrolls, ancient leather and papyrus covered in Hebrew writing that no one in his village could read. Muhammad didn't know he was holding documents that were over 2,000 years old. He didn't know that these scrolls contained texts that predated the oldest known manuscripts of the Bible by a millennium. All he knew was that they looked old, and old things sometimes had value in the markets of Bethlehem. But someone else knew exactly what they were worth, and that someone had been waiting a very long time for them to surface. The scrolls made their way through a chain of antiquities dealers, each hand that touched them understanding a little more of their significance. When they finally reached the attention of scholars in 1947, the excitement was immediate. These weren't just any ancient texts. They were Hebrew manuscripts from the time of Jesus, possibly even earlier. For the first time in history, scholars would have access to biblical texts that hadn't been filtered through centuries of copying, translation, and editing by Christian scribes. But excitement quickly turned to concern when researchers began to actually read what was written on those ancient scrolls, because the texts didn't match the story the world had been told about the origins of Christianity. They told a different tale entirely. Within months of the first discovery, more caves were found. 11 caves in total, containing over 900 manuscripts and tens of thousands of fragments. The sheer volume of material was staggering, but what was more staggering was the content. These scrolls described a Jewish religious community that had existed before Jesus was born, a community with rituals, beliefs, and even a messianic figure that bore striking similarities to what would later become Christian doctrine. They called themselves the Yehad, meaning the unity. They lived in isolation near the Dead Sea, following strict laws and awaiting the coming of not one, but two messiahs. They practiced baptism, held communal meals, and believed in the immortality of the soul. Their leader was called the Teacher of Righteousness, a figure who had been persecuted by the establishment and whose followers believed he would return to judge the world. Sound familiar? These weren't Christians. These weren't followers of Jesus. These were Jews living decades, possibly centuries before Jesus was born. Yet their beliefs, their practices, even their organizational structure seemed to prefigure Christianity in ways that were impossible to ignore. The scrolls contained commentaries on biblical texts, apocalyptic visions, and detailed rules for community life. But they also contained something else, something that would make the Vatican very nervous. They contained critiques of the temple priesthood in Jerusalem, condemnations of corruption, prophecies about the end times, and most disturbing of all, they contained texts that seemed to know things about Christian theology that they shouldn't have known. One scroll, later called the Community Rule, described a ritual meal of bread and wine that would be presided over by a priest and attended by the Messiah when he came. Another scroll, the Damascus document, spoke of a new covenant that God would make with his people. The language was so close to Christian terminology that early scholars wondered if they had discovered a Christian monastery that had somehow been misdated. But the dating was solid. Carbon dating, paleography, the archaeological context, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. These scrolls were pre-Christian, which meant that the ideas, the rituals, the theological concepts that Christianity claimed as its own innovations had been developed by someone else first. Someone the Church had never acknowledged. Someone whose very existence called into question the uniqueness of Jesus and the originality of Christian doctrine.
The Vatican had a problem. It wasn't just the content of the scrolls that worried church officials, it was the timing of their discovery. The late 1940s was a period when the Catholic Church was already dealing with challenges to its authority. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian unity centuries earlier. Modern biblical scholarship was beginning to question the historical accuracy of the Gospels. And now, just as the Church was trying to reassert its relevance in the modern world, along came ancient documents that threatened to undermine the very foundations of Christian faith. The problem wasn't that the scrolls disproved Christianity. The problem was that they suggested Christianity wasn't as unique as it claimed to be. If Jewish communities before Jesus were already practicing baptism, expecting a Messiah, and interpreting Scripture in ways that would later be called Christian, then what made Christianity special? What made Jesus different from other Jewish teachers of his time? These were dangerous questions. The kind of questions that could lead people to doubt not just specific doctrines, but the entire edifice of organized religion. If Christianity was just another Jewish sect that happened to be successful, if Jesus was just another in a long line of messianic figures, then what was the point of the Church? What was the point of papal authority? What was the point of 2,000 years of Christian civilization? The Vatican couldn't allow those questions to be asked, so they made sure they wouldn't be. At first, the Church's response was subtle. Catholic scholars were among the first to gain access to the scrolls, and they were quick to downplay any parallels between Qumran and Christianity. The similarities were coincidental, they argued, superficial, the result of both communities drawing from common Jewish traditions. It was nothing to worry about. Nothing that threatened Christian orthodoxy. But privately, the Vatican was taking a very different approach. In 1952, the Vatican established its own team of scholars to work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Officially, this was presented as the Church's contribution to biblical scholarship. Unofficially, it was a way to control the narrative. By having Catholic priests and scholars directly involved in the translation and interpretation of the scrolls, the Vatican could ensure that any inconvenient truths remained buried. And buried they would remain for nearly 50 years. The man chosen to lead this effort was Father Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican priest and archaeologist. De Vaux was brilliant, meticulous, and absolutely loyal to the Church. He was also the perfect choice for a delicate mission that required both scholarly credentials and unwavering commitment to protecting Catholic interests. Under de Vaux' leadership, the international team tasked with studying the scrolls became increasingly exclusive. Access to unpublished materials was limited to a small circle of mostly Christian scholars. Publication schedules were delayed repeatedly, and when fragments of scrolls did make their way into print, they were often accompanied by interpretations that minimized any connections to early Christianity. The official explanation was that the work was complex and time-consuming. Ancient manuscripts required careful study. Fragments had to be painstakingly pieced together. Translations needed to be checked and rechecked. All of this was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some of the most significant scrolls were being deliberately withheld from publication. Texts that contained the most explicit parallels to Christian doctrine were locked away in climate-controlled vaults, accessible only to a handful of scholars who had signed agreements not to discuss their contents publicly. One of those texts was a document that scholars privately called the Son of God fragment. Written in Aramaic, the same language Jesus would have spoken, it described a figure who would be called the Son of God and the Son of the Most High. The fragment was tiny, just a few lines on a piece of papyrus, but those few lines were enough to send shockwaves through the team studying it.
Here was a pre-Christian Jewish text using the exact titles that the Gospels would later apply to Jesus. If this fragment predated Christianity, as the archaeological evidence suggested, then either Jesus had adopted titles that were already in use, or the Gospel writers had borrowed from earlier Jewish traditions when they described Jesus. Neither possibility was good news for the Church. The fragment was photographed, cataloged, and then quietly set aside. It would be nearly 40 years before the public learned of its existence, and even then, the translation that was eventually published would be carefully worded to minimize its implications. This pattern would repeat itself again and again over the following decades. Significant texts would be discovered, studied in private, and then either published with careful interpretation or withheld entirely. The Vatican and its allies had effectively created a bottleneck that allowed them to control not just what the world knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but how it was interpreted. But they couldn't control everything, and eventually the truth would begin to leak out. The first cracks in the Vatican's carefully constructed wall of silence appeared in the 1960s. A few independent scholars who had managed to gain limited access to the scrolls began to notice discrepancies between what they were seeing and what was being published. Photos of fragments didn't match the official transcriptions. Key passages seemed to have been omitted from published translations, and some of the most interesting texts were being indefinitely delayed. Jean-Marco Allegro, a British philologist and one of the few non-Christian members of the international team, was the first to speak out publicly. In a series of lectures and articles in the 1960s, Allegro argued that the parallels between the Qumran community and early Christianity were far more significant than the official publications suggested. He claimed that Christianity had essentially appropriated the beliefs and practices of an earlier Jewish sect and repackaged them around the figure of Jesus. Allegro's conclusions were controversial and his methods were sometimes questionable, but his basic observation that important information was being suppressed was accurate. The Vatican and its allies quickly moved to discredit him. His academic reputation was destroyed, his access to unpublished materials was revoked, and his theories were dismissed as the ravings of a publicity-seeking iconoclast. But Allegro had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Other scholars began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why were so many important texts still unpublished decades after their discovery? Why was access to photographs and transcriptions so strictly limited? And why did the official interpretations seem to consistently minimize any connections between Qumran and Christianity? The answers to those questions would eventually bring down the entire structure of secrecy that the Vatican had built around the Dead Sea Scrolls. But that wouldn't happen for another 30 years. And in the meantime, the Church would take increasingly desperate measures to protect its secrets. Because the truth about the Dead Sea Scrolls wasn't just academically inconvenient, it was existentially threatening. These ancient documents didn't just challenge specific Christian doctrines.
They challenged the entire narrative upon which the Church's authority was based. If Christianity wasn't unique, if its central beliefs had been developed by earlier Jewish communities, if Jesus was just one of many messianic figures who had claimed to fulfill ancient prophecies, then what made the Roman Catholic Church different from any other human institution? What gave it the right to claim exclusive access to divine truth? These were questions the Vatican couldn't allow to be asked, because once people started asking them, the answers might lead to the collapse of everything the Church had built over 2 millennia. So the scrolls remained hidden. The translations remained incomplete. The interpretations remained carefully controlled, and the world remained ignorant of one of the most significant discoveries in human history. But ignorance, like innocence, cannot last forever. Eventually, the truth finds a way to surface, and when it does, the consequences are always more dramatic than they would have been if the truth had been told from the beginning. The Dead Sea Scrolls were about to teach the Vatican that lesson in the most public and embarrassing way possible. John Marco Allegro should have kept his mouth shut. That's what his colleagues told him in 1956 when he first started asking uncomfortable questions about the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what his superiors at the University of Manchester suggested when he began challenging the official interpretations. And that's certainly what the Vatican wished when he decided to go public with his theories about what those ancient texts really contained. But Allegro was not a man who kept quiet when he saw injustice, and what he witnessed in the Scrolls Project during the 1950s and 60s was nothing short of academic fraud on a massive scale. Texts were being mistranslated, key passages were being omitted, and the most dangerous scrolls were being locked away indefinitely while the world was fed sanitized versions of the truth. So Allegro spoke out, and the Vatican made sure he would never speak with authority again. The destruction of John Marco Allegro was not an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to send a message to any other scholar who might be tempted to reveal inconvenient truths about the Dead Sea Scrolls. What happened to Allegro would serve as a warning for the next 30 years. Cross the Church's interests and your career will be destroyed. Your reputation will be shattered. Your life's work will be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. And it almost worked. In 1953, John Marco Allegro was one of the rising stars of biblical scholarship. A brilliant philologist with expertise in ancient languages, he had been invited to join the exclusive international team studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. At 33, he was the youngest member of the group and the only one who wasn't a Christian. This last fact would prove to be both his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall. Because Allegro had no religious agenda. He wasn't trying to protect Christian doctrine or defend the uniqueness of Jesus. He was simply trying to read the ancient texts as accurately as possible and understand what they actually said. This made him incredibly valuable to the team's work. It also made him incredibly dangerous to those who wanted to control how that work was interpreted. The first signs of trouble appeared in 1956. Allegro had been working on fragments from Cave 4, some of the most significant texts discovered at Qumran. Among these fragments was a document that would later be known as 4Q246, the Son of God text. As Allegro studied this Aramaic fragment, he realized he was looking at something extraordinary. Here was a pre-Christian Jewish text that described a figure who would be called the Son of God and the Son of the Most High. These were the exact titles that the Gospel of Luke would later apply to Jesus, but this text predated Christianity. The implications were staggering. Allegro brought his findings to the team's regular meetings in Jerusalem. He expected excitement, perhaps even celebration. Instead, he was met with uncomfortable silence. Father Devotes, the team leader, quickly moved to have the fragment reclassified as preliminary and placed under embargo. Publication would be delayed indefinitely pending further study. But Allegro had already made copies, and he had already begun to see the pattern. Fragment after fragment told the same story. The Qumran community had beliefs and practices that were remarkably similar to what would later become Christianity. They spoke of a teacher of righteousness who had been persecuted and possibly killed. They expected a Messiah who would judge the world and establish God's kingdom. They practiced baptism and held communal meals. They believed in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the dead. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to know about Christian concepts that they shouldn't have known about, if those concepts were truly original to Jesus and his followers. Allegro began to piece together a theory that would shake the foundations of Christian faith. What if Christianity wasn't the unique revelation it claimed to be? What if Jesus was simply one of many Jewish teachers who had been influenced by the theological innovations of communities like Qumran? What if the entire Christian story was built on ideas that had been developed decades or even centuries earlier by Jewish sectarians living in the desert? In 1956, Allegro decided to test these ideas publicly. In a series of radio broadcasts for the BBC, he suggested that Christianity might have borrowed many of its central concepts from earlier Jewish sources. The response was swift and brutal. Father Devotes immediately convened an emergency meeting of the international team. Allegro was accused of sensationalism and scholarly irresponsibility. His access to unpublished materials was restricted, and a letter was drafted, signed by his Christian colleagues, publicly distancing the team from his premature and inappropriate statements.
The letter was published in the Times of London in March 1956. It was a devastating blow to Allegro's reputation. His own colleagues were accusing him of misrepresenting their work and drawing conclusions that the evidence didn't support. For most scholars, this would have been the end of their involvement in the project. But Allegro was just getting started. Instead of backing down, Allegro doubled down. If his colleagues wouldn't allow him to discuss his findings openly, he would find other ways to get the truth out. He began writing popular books about the Dead Sea Scrolls, aimed at general audiences rather than academic specialists. He gave lectures across Britain and America, sharing his theories with anyone who would listen, and he continued to push for the publication of texts that his colleagues seemed determined to keep hidden. This only made things worse. The Vatican and its allies realized that they were dealing with a scholar who couldn't be controlled through normal academic channels. More drastic measures would be needed. The campaign against Allegro escalated in the early 1960s. His academic papers were rejected by journals. His applications for research funding were denied. Conference organizers stopped inviting him to speak. Former colleagues began to avoid him at scholarly gatherings. It was a systematic effort to isolate him from the academic community and destroy his credibility. But the Vatican saved its most devastating attack for last. In 1970, Allegro published his most controversial book, The Secret Mushroom and the Cross. In it, he argued that Christianity had its origins not in the life and teachings of a historical Jesus, but in ancient fertility cults that used hallucinogenic mushrooms to induce religious experiences. The entire Christian story, according to Allegro, was an elaborate myth designed to disguise the drug-based origins of the religion. The book was immediately denounced by scholars across the theological spectrum. It was called pseudo-scholarly, sensationalistic, and completely without foundation. Allegro's reputation was shattered overnight. He was dismissed from his position at the University of Manchester, his access to the Dead Sea Scrolls was permanently revoked, and he was effectively excommunicated from the world of biblical scholarship. But here's what most people don't know about the sacred mushroom and the cross. It wasn't really about mushrooms. It was about silencing John Marco Allegro. Evidence that emerged decades later suggests that Allegro had been pushed to the breaking point by years of academic persecution. His mushroom theory, however flawed, was born out of frustration with the systematic suppression of his legitimate findings about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unable to publish his real discoveries about the parallels between Qumran and Christianity, he had retreated into increasingly speculative territory. The Vatican had achieved its goal. Allegro's credibility was destroyed so thoroughly that even his valid observations about the scrolls were dismissed, along with his mushroom theories. Any future scholar who tried to draw connections between Qumran and Christianity would be accused of following in Allegro's footsteps. The specter of the mushroom man would haunt Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship for decades. But Allegro wasn't the only scholar who had noticed problems with the Scrolls project. He was just the most vocal. Others were watching, taking notes, and beginning to organize resistance. Edmund Wilson, the influential American literary critic, had been following the Scrolls controversy since the 1950s. In 1969, he published The Dead Sea Scrolls, 1947 to 1969, a scathing indictment of the way the texts were being handled. Wilson accused the international team of deliberate suppression and suggested that religious bias was preventing important discoveries from reaching the public. Wilson's book caused a sensation. Unlike Allegro, Wilson wasn't a biblical scholar and couldn't be dismissed as easily. He was a respected intellectual with no particular axe to grind. When he accused the Scrolls team of academic misconduct, people listened. The Vatican's response was swift and predictable. Wilson was attacked as an outsider who didn't understand the complexities of scroll scholarship. His critics pointed out that he couldn't read Hebrew or Aramaic and therefore was unqualified to comment on translation issues. But Wilson's central point was harder to dismiss. Why were so many important texts still unpublished more than 20 years after their discovery?
The answer, Wilson suggested, was that those texts contained information that powerful religious institutions didn't want the public to see. Other voices began to join the criticism. Robert Eisenman, a scholar at California State University Long Beach, started asking pointed questions about the dating of the scrolls and their relationship to early Christianity. Norman Golb at the University of Chicago challenged the consensus view that all the scrolls came from a single religious community. These scholars didn't agree with each other on everything, but they shared a common belief that important information was being suppressed. The Vatican found itself fighting a multi-front war against scholars who refused to accept the official line. But the Church had learned from the Allegro experience. Instead of trying to destroy these critics directly, it adopted a more sophisticated strategy. The new approach was to control access to the scrolls themselves. In the 1970s, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, working closely with the international team, began to tighten restrictions on who could photograph unpublished materials. Scholars who asked too many uncomfortable questions found their research permits delayed or denied. Those who cooperated with the official interpretation were rewarded with access to new fragments and prestigious publication opportunities. It was a carrot-and-stick approach that proved remarkably effective. Most scholars chose the carrot. Meanwhile, the Vatican continued to use its considerable influence to shape public understanding of the scrolls. Catholic scholars dominated the major academic journals. Catholic institutions funded much of the research, and Catholic interpretations of the texts became the accepted scholarly consensus, not because they were necessarily correct, but because they were the only interpretations that could get published. The system worked so well that by the late 1970s, most people had forgotten about the early controversies. The Dead Sea Scrolls were presented to the public as interesting but ultimately non-threatening documents that confirmed the reliability of biblical texts without challenging any fundamental Christian beliefs. But the critics hadn't given up. They had simply gone underground. In the 1980s, a new generation of scholars began to emerge who had been trained outside the traditional Christian academic establishment. These scholars brought fresh perspectives and new methodologies to the study of ancient texts. More importantly, they had no institutional loyalty to the churches that had controlled scroll scholarship for decades. They also had something their predecessors had lacked: technology. The development of computer databases made it possible to analyze texts in ways that had never been possible before. Scholars could now search for patterns, compare vocabularies, and identify literary relationships with unprecedented precision. And when they turned these new tools on the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found exactly what John Marco Allegro had found 30 years earlier. The parallels between Qumran and Christianity weren't coincidental. They weren't superficial. They were systematic and profound. The Qumran community had developed a complex theological system that would later be incorporated into Christian doctrine. The teacher of righteousness wasn't just another Jewish teacher. He was a messianic figure whose story bore striking similarities to the gospel accounts of Jesus. But now these scholars had the data to prove it. And more importantly, they had the will to fight for the right to share that data with the world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose decades of suppression and forever change how the world understood the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. The Vatican's carefully constructed wall of silence was about to come crashing down, and this time there would be no stopping it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a young computer programmer named Ben Zion Wacholder. In the late 1980s, Wacholder had been hired by Hebrew Union College to create a database of published scroll fragments. As he worked with the texts, he noticed something that had escaped the attention of more traditional scholars. Many of the published fragments were incomplete. Key passages had been left out of the official transcriptions, and some of the most interesting texts existed only as brief summaries and scholarly footnotes, with no full translation available anywhere. Wacholder realized that he could use computer analysis to reconstruct the missing portions of these texts. By comparing vocabulary, syntax, and literary style across different fragments, he could identify patterns and fill in gaps. It was detective work on a massive scale, made possible by technology that hadn't existed when the scrolls were first discovered. What Wacholder found in those reconstructed texts would trigger the final collapse of the Vatican's control over Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship.
September 22, 1991, the day the Vatican's 40-year stranglehold on the Dead Sea Scrolls finally broke. Not through diplomatic negotiation or scholarly consensus, but through an act of academic rebellion that would be remembered as the liberation of biblical scholarship. At 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time, Dr. William Moffett, director of the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, walked into a packed press conference and said 7 words that changed everything. The scrolls are now available to all scholars. The room erupted. Phone calls flooded the library, and in the Vatican, emergency meetings were convened as decades of carefully constructed secrecy came crashing down in a single afternoon. But the story of how those scrolls reached the Huntington Library and why they were finally released to the public reveals a web of deception, academic courage, and technological breakthrough that the Vatican had never seen coming. By 1988, the suppression of the Dead Sea Scrolls had become an open secret in academic circles. 41 years after their discovery, over half of the most important texts remained unpublished. The international team responsible for studying them had become a closed society, passing control from one generation of Christian scholars to the next like a hereditary priesthood. But technology was about to change everything. Ben Zion Wacholder, working at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, had spent 3 years developing a computer program that could analyze fragmentary Hebrew texts and reconstruct missing portions. What started as an academic exercise in digital humanities was about to become the key that unlocked the Vatican's most guarded secrets. Wacholder's breakthrough came when he realized that the brief summaries and partial quotations published in scholarly footnotes contained enough information to reconstruct entire texts. The international team had been so focused on controlling complete manuscripts that they had overlooked the fact that decades of academic papers contained thousands of pieces of the puzzle. Working with his graduate student Martin Abegg, Wacholder began feeding every published reference to unpublished scroll fragments into his computer. Hebrew words, Aramaic phrases, biblical references, scholarly comments, all of it went into the database. Then the program began looking for patterns. What it found was extraordinary. Text after text began to emerge from the fragmentary references like photographs developing in a darkroom. The computer was reconstructing manuscripts that had been hidden from public view for decades. By late 1990, Wacholder and Abegg had reconstructed substantial portions of over 50 unpublished texts. They called it a preliminary edition of the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were preparing to publish it through the Biblical Archaeology Society in Washington, D.C. When word of their work reached the international team, panic set in. Father Joseph Fitzmyer, one of the Catholic scholars on the team, immediately contacted Wacholder and demanded that he halt publication. The reconstructions were unauthorized, Fitzmyer argued. They were based on incomplete information and could mislead the public. The proper academic process needed to be followed. But Wacholder had anticipated this response. His reconstructions were clearly labeled as preliminary and based on published sources. He wasn't violating any copyrights or academic ethics. He was simply doing what scholars were supposed to do, making information publicly available for study and debate. The Vatican tried a different approach. Through its contacts in the Israeli government, the Church attempted to have Wacholder's work classified as a threat to archaeological preservation. If these reconstructions were published, the argument went, it would set a dangerous precedent that could compromise future archaeological projects. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, under pressure from both the Vatican and the international team, issued a statement condemning the planned publication. They warned that any scholar who used the reconstructed texts in their research would be banned from accessing actual scroll materials in the future. It was academic blackmail, pure and simple, and for most scholars, it worked. The threat of being cut off from the scrolls was too great a risk to take. But Wacholder wasn't most scholars, and he had an ally that the Vatican hadn't counted on. Herschel Shanks, the combative editor of Biblical Archaeology Review.
Shanks had been fighting the Scrolls cartel for years, using his magazine to expose the delays, the secrecy, and the academic politics that kept important texts hidden from view. When Wacholder approached him about publishing the reconstructions, Shanks didn't hesitate. In September 1991, the Biblical Archaeology Society announced that it would publish Wacholder's reconstructed texts as a 2-volume set titled A Preliminary Edition of the Unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls. The Vatican's monopoly was about to be broken. But Shanks had an even bigger surprise waiting. For years, rumors had circulated about a complete set of photographs of all the scroll fragments that had been taken in the 1950s and 60s. These photographs, if they existed, would contain images of every unpublished text, making it impossible for the international team to continue their suppression. The rumors were true, and the photographs were sitting in the Huntington Library in California. The story of how those photographs reached the Huntington is itself a tale of academic intrigue. In the 1980s, the Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center for Preservation and Research had been given permission to create preservation photographs of the scroll fragments. The center, based in Claremont, California, was headed by James Sanders, a scholar who had grown increasingly frustrated with the delays in publication. Sanders had made copies of the photographs and deposited them in several libraries for safekeeping. One of those libraries was the Huntington. The photographs were supposed to be used only for preservation purposes, with access strictly limited to the international team. But by 1991, Sanders had had enough of the secrecy.
When Shanks contacted him about the possibility of making the photographs available to scholars, Sanders was receptive, but he couldn't make the decision himself. That would have to come from the library director. William Moffat was an unlikely revolutionary. A soft-spoken librarian with a background in medieval manuscripts, he had no particular expertise in biblical studies, but he had strong opinions about academic freedom and the public's right to access scholarly materials. When Shanks approached Moffat about releasing the scroll photographs, the director's response was immediate. If we have them and they're of scholarly value, then they should be available to scholars. It was that simple and that revolutionary. On September 22, 1991, Moffat announced that the Huntington Library would make its collection of Dead Sea Scroll photographs available to any qualified scholar without restriction. The 44-year monopoly was over. The reaction was swift and furious. The Israeli Antiquities Authority immediately threatened legal action. The international team accused the Huntington of violating ethical standards and endangering archaeological preservation. Father Fitzmyer called the release completely irresponsible. But the Vatican's strongest condemnation came from an unexpected source, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI. In a strongly worded statement, Ratzinger accused the Huntington Library of undermining the authority of legitimate biblical scholarship and warned of dangerous consequences for the faith of believers. It was a remarkable admission. The future pope was essentially acknowledging that unrestricted access to the Dead Sea Scrolls posed a threat to Christian faith. The question was, why? The answer began to emerge almost immediately as scholars rushed to examine the newly available photographs. Text after text revealed parallels to Christian doctrine that had been downplayed or ignored in the official publications. The Son of God fragment that had been buried for decades turned out to be even more significant than John Marco Allegro had suspected. Other texts described messianic figures, apocalyptic visions, and theological concepts that bore striking similarities to the New Testament. But the most shocking discovery came from a text that scholars began calling the Pierced Messiah fragment. Written in Hebrew on a small piece of parchment, it described a messianic figure who would be pierced and whose death would have redemptive significance for his followers. Here was a pre-Christian Jewish text that seemed to anticipate not just the crucifixion of Jesus, but the theological interpretation that Christians would later place on that event. If this text was authentic, and the paleographic evidence suggested it was, then the Christian understanding of Jesus' death as a redemptive sacrifice might not have been a unique revelation. It might have been borrowed from earlier Jewish traditions.
The implications were staggering, and they were exactly what the Vatican had been trying to prevent for 4 decades. As more scholars gained access to the photographs and began publishing their own translations and interpretations, the official story of the Dead Sea Scrolls began to collapse. The sanitized version that had been fed to the public for decades was replaced by a much more complex and challenging picture. The Qumran community wasn't just another Jewish sect. They were theological innovators whose ideas had profoundly influenced the development of Christianity. Their teacher of righteousness wasn't just another messianic pretender. He was a figure whose story had been incorporated into the gospel accounts of Jesus. Most challenging of all, Christianity wasn't the unique revelation it claimed to be. It was part of a broader Jewish movement that had been developing messianic and apocalyptic ideas for centuries before Jesus was born. These conclusions weren't accepted without resistance. Conservative Christian scholars fought back with articles, books, and conferences designed to minimize the significance of the new findings. They argued that the parallels were coincidental, that the similarities were superficial, that the radical interpretations were based on flawed translations. But they were fighting a losing battle. With unrestricted access to the scroll photographs, independent scholars were able to check the official translations against the original texts. Time and again, they found evidence of mistranslation, selective quotation, and deliberate omission.
the Vatican's carefully constructed interpretation of the scrolls crumbled under scrutiny, and with it went 40 years of suppression, secrecy, and scholarly dishonesty. But the Church wasn't ready to give up without a fight. If it couldn't control access to the scrolls, it would try to control how they were interpreted. A new phase of the battle was about to begin, and this time, the Vatican would use every weapon in its arsenal. Because the stakes had never been higher. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just challenging specific Christian doctrines anymore. They were challenging the entire narrative upon which the Church's authority was based, and that was something the Vatican simply couldn't allow. The war for the scrolls was entering its final phase, and the casualties would be felt throughout the Christian world. Robert Eisenman had been waiting for this moment for 20 years. A scholar at California State University, Long Beach, Eisenman had been one of the most vocal critics of the Scrolls cartel throughout the 1980s. He had written books, given lectures, and filed lawsuits in an attempt to force the release of unpublished texts. Now, with the Huntington photographs available, he finally had the evidence he needed to prove his theories. Eisenman's interpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls was even more radical than Allegro's had been. He argued that the texts weren't just pre-Christian Jewish documents. They were contemporary with early Christianity and reflected the actual beliefs and practices of James the Just, the brother of Jesus, who had led the Jerusalem church after the crucifixion. According to Eisenman, the teacher of righteousness mentioned in the scrolls wasn't a figure from the distant past. He was James himself. The wicked priest who persecuted the teacher was the Apostle Paul, who had corrupted Jesus' original Jewish message with Hellenistic ideas about divine salvation. The implications were explosive. If Eisenman was right, then the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just background material for understanding Christianity. They were the actual documents of the earliest Christian community, showing that the religion had been fundamentally different from what the Church later claimed. Eisenman's theories were controversial even among scholars who supported greater access to the scrolls. Many found his arguments speculative and his methods questionable, but his basic insight that the scrolls were much closer to early Christianity than anyone had admitted was harder to dismiss. As Eisenman published his new interpretations of the newly available texts, the Vatican realized that the Huntington liberation had created an even bigger problem than they had initially understood. It wasn't just about making hidden texts available. It was about losing control over how those texts were understood. For 40 years, the Church had been able to ensure that scroll scholarship remained within acceptable bounds. Radical theories could be marginalized. Dangerous interpretations could be suppressed. But now, with hundreds of scholars around the world gaining access to the photographs, that control was gone forever. The revolution that began on September 22, 1991, was just the beginning. The real transformation of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship was still to come.
The text was only 11 lines long, 11 lines of ancient Hebrew written on a fragment of parchment no bigger than a playing card. But those 11 lines would shake Christianity to its foundations and force the Vatican to confront its worst nightmare: proof that the story of Jesus might not be original after all. Fragment 4Q285, discovered in Cave 4 at Qumran, but hidden from public view for over 40 years, contained a passage that scholars would eventually call the Pierced Messiah text. When it was finally translated after the Huntington liberation, the implications were immediate and terrifying for anyone who believed in the uniqueness of Christ's sacrifice. The fragment described a messianic figure who would be pierced and whose death would bring about the redemption of his people.
Written at least a century before Jesus was born, it seemed to anticipate not just the crucifixion, but the entire Christian theology of redemptive suffering. The Vatican had known about this text since the 1950s, and they had been desperately trying to keep it secret ever since. Dr. Giza Vermes was the first scholar to publish a complete translation of the pierced Messiah fragment after gaining access to the Huntington photographs in late 1991. A Hungarian Jewish scholar working at Oxford University, Vermes had built his reputation on careful, conservative interpretations of ancient texts. He was not given to sensationalism or wild theories, which made his translation of 4Q285 all the more devastating. The key passage, as Vermes rendered it, read, "They will put to death the prince of the congregation, the branch of David, but God will not abandon him to the grave, and he will be pierced for the transgressions of his people." The language was unmistakable. Here was a pre-Christian Jewish text describing a messianic figure who would die a violent death, be pierced, and whose suffering would have redemptive value for his followers. The parallels to Christian theology were so exact that several scholars initially suspected the fragment was a forgery. But the paleographic evidence was solid. The handwriting matched other texts from Qumran. The parchment showed the same patterns of aging. The Hebrew terminology was consistent with 1st century BCE usage. There was no doubt about the fragment's authenticity, which meant there was no escaping its implications. Within weeks of Vermes's publication, Catholic scholars launched a coordinated counterattack. Father Joseph Fitzmyer led the charge with an alternative translation that completely changed the meaning of the text. According to Fitzmyer's reading, the fragment didn't describe a Messiah who would be pierced. Instead, it described a Messiah who would pierce his enemies. The difference came down to a single Hebrew word, yidkeru. Depending on how you read the grammar, it could mean either he will be pierced or he will pierce. Vermes had chosen the first reading. Fitzmyer insisted on the second. It was a classic example of how translation could be used as a weapon in theological warfare. Both readings were grammatically possible. Both could be supported by reference to Hebrew syntax and biblical usage, but only one threatened the foundations of Christian faith. The debate over 4Q285 raged in scholarly journals for months. Conservative Christian scholars rallied around Fitzmyer's interpretation, arguing that Vermes had been influenced by his desire to find parallels to Christianity. Liberal scholars supported Vermes, pointing out that the pierced Messiah reading made better sense in the context of other Qumran texts. But the real battle wasn't being fought in academic journals. It was being fought in the corridors of the Vatican, where cardinals and theologians were grappling with the question that struck at the heart of Catholic doctrine. If Jewish communities before Jesus had already developed the idea of a suffering redemptive Messiah, what made Jesus special?
The answer the Vatican settled on was both clever and deeply dishonest. They would acknowledge that some Jewish groups had indeed developed messianic ideas before Christianity, but they would argue that these ideas were themselves divinely inspired prophecies of Jesus' coming. The pierced Messiah fragment wasn't evidence that Christianity borrowed from Judaism. It was evidence that God had prepared the Jewish people to recognize Jesus when he arrived. It was a theological sleight of hand that allowed the Church to have it both ways. The parallels between Qumran and Christianity weren't threats to faith. They were confirmations of divine providence. God had planted seeds of Christian truth in pre-Christian Jewish communities, so that when Jesus came, at least some Jews would be ready to accept him. This interpretation had the advantage of being unfalsifiable. Any similarity between the Dead Sea Scrolls and Christian doctrine could be explained as divine preparation rather than human borrowing. It also allowed the Vatican to maintain the essential uniqueness of Jesus while acknowledging the obvious parallels that scholars were discovering. But not everyone was convinced by the Church's theological gymnastics. Barbara Thiering, an Australian scholar who had gained access to the Huntington photographs, was developing an even more radical interpretation of the scrolls. According to Thiering's theory, Jesus hadn't just been influenced by the Qumran community, he had actually been a member of it. Thiering argued that many of the figures mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls could be identified with people from the New Testament. The teacher of righteousness wasn't a figure from the distant past, he was John the Baptist. The wicked priest who opposed him was the high priest Caiaphas. And Jesus himself appeared in the scrolls under the title the Star or the Branch of David. According to Thiering's reconstruction, Jesus had been trained at Qumran before beginning his public ministry. His teachings, his baptismal practices, even his understanding of messianic prophecy had all been shaped by the sectarian community by the Dead Sea. Christianity wasn't a new revelation. It was an offshoot of an existing Jewish sect. Thiering's theories were even more controversial than Eisenman's. Most scholars dismissed them as speculative and poorly supported by evidence. But like Eisenman, Thiering was raising questions that couldn't be easily answered. If the Qumran community had indeed developed Christian-like beliefs and practices before Jesus, how could the Church maintain that Christianity was uniquely divine? The Vatican's response was swift and comprehensive. A new generation of Catholic scholars was trained specifically to combat the radical interpretations of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were given access to Vatican archives, funding for research projects, and platforms in prestigious journals. Their mission was to develop orthodox interpretations of the scrolls that would neutralize any threat to Christian doctrine. The strategy worked, at least partially. By the mid-1990s, the academic mainstream had largely rejected the more extreme theories of scholars like Eisenman and Thiering. The consensus view that emerged was a more moderate one. The Qumran community had indeed developed some ideas that were similar to Christianity, but these similarities were the result of both groups drawing from common Jewish traditions rather than direct influence. But the damage had been done. The image of the Dead Sea Scrolls as harmless confirmations of biblical reliability had been shattered. Even the moderate scholarly consensus acknowledged that the scrolls revealed a much more complex and diverse Jewish religious landscape than had previously been understood. Christianity wasn't emerging into a theological vacuum, it was one of several competing Jewish movements, each with its own interpretation of messianic prophecy and apocalyptic expectation.
This more nuanced understanding of early Judaism was itself threatening to traditional Christian claims about the uniqueness of Jesus. If first-century Palestine was full of charismatic teachers proclaiming the coming kingdom of God, if messianic expectations were widespread, if various Jewish groups were already practicing baptism and developing ideas about redemptive suffering, then Jesus became one figure among many rather than a singular divine intervention in human history. The Vatican found itself in the uncomfortable position of having to defend not just the divinity of Jesus, but his historical distinctiveness. It wasn't enough to argue that Jesus was God incarnate. They also had to show that he was unlike anyone who had come before. This challenge was complicated by another disturbing discovery that emerged from the newly available scroll photographs. Several fragments suggested that the Qumran community had expected not one Messiah, but two, a priestly Messiah and a royal Messiah, who would work together to establish God's kingdom. This two-Messiah theology was completely foreign to Christian understanding, which had always focused on Jesus as a single, unified messianic figure. But it raised interesting questions about some of the more puzzling aspects of the gospel accounts. Why did Jesus sometimes seem to emphasize his priestly role and sometimes his royal status? Why were there tensions in the early church between those who saw him primarily as a teacher and those who saw him as a king? Some scholars began to suggest that the historical Jesus might have been trying to fulfill both messianic roles,
combining expectations that the Qumran community had kept separate. Others argued that the Gospel writers had edited together stories about two different figures, creating a composite Messiah who never actually existed. These theories remained highly speculative and were rejected by most scholars, but they illustrated how the Dead Sea Scrolls had opened up new ways of thinking about Christian origins that were deeply unsettling to traditional believers. The Vatican's attempts to control the narrative were further complicated by the emergence of the Internet in the 1990s. For the first time in history, alternative interpretations of the scrolls could be disseminated directly to the public without going through the filter of academic journals or religious institutions. Websites dedicated to radical interpretations of the Dead Sea Scrolls began to proliferate. Discussion forums allowed amateur researchers to share their theories and challenge orthodox interpretations. The Vatican's carefully constructed consensus was being undermined by a new medium that they couldn't control. The Church responded by developing its own internet presence, funding websites and online resources that promoted orthodox interpretations of the scrolls. But it was a defensive strategy that acknowledged how much the landscape had changed since the Huntington liberation. The days when a small group of Christian scholars could control access to ancient texts and shape their interpretation were over. The Dead Sea Scrolls had entered the digital age, and with it, the democratization of biblical scholarship. But the most significant challenge to the Vatican's position was yet to come. Hidden among the thousands of fragments in the scroll collection was a text that would force the Church to confront the most dangerous question of all. What if Jesus himself had been wrong about who he was? The fragment that would pose this ultimate challenge was sitting in a file cabinet in Jerusalem, mislabeled and forgotten. It would take another decade before scholars realized what they had found, but when they did, it would trigger the final crisis in the Vatican's relationship with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge, even when the evidence is written in stone. And the Vatican was about to discover that denial has its limits when the past refuses to stay buried.
Dr. Emile Puech had been staring at the same fragment for 3 months when he finally saw it. Fragment 4Q 521, catalog number 7, line 12. 11 Hebrew words that had been sitting in a file cabinet in Jerusalem since 1958, mislabeled as a messianic fragment, routine eschatological text. But there was nothing routine about what those 11 words actually said. The fragment described a figure who would heal the wounded, resurrect the dead, and bring good news to the poor, written in Hebrew, dated to approximately 100 BCE, a full century before Jesus was born. Puech, a French scholar working with the École Biblique in Jerusalem, felt his hands shake as he cross-referenced the language with the New Testament. The parallels weren't just close, they were exact. Luke 7:22 used almost identical phrasing when describing Jesus' ministry. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. It was 2001, 10 years after the Huntington liberation. Digital analysis had advanced to the point where scholars could now search databases of scroll fragments using sophisticated algorithms. That's how Puech had found this fragment in the first place. He had been looking for references to resurrection in the Dead Sea Scrolls when the computer flagged 4Q 521 as containing potentially relevant material. What he found was the Vatican's worst nightmare realized: proof that the specific works attributed to Jesus in the Gospels had been predicted in pre-Christian Jewish texts, not as vague prophecies but as detailed descriptions of what a true Messiah would accomplish. The implications were staggering. Either Jesus had deliberately modeled his ministry on pre-existing Jewish expectations, or the Gospel writers had retrofitted earlier messianic prophecies onto Jesus' story. Either way, the uniqueness of Christ's mission was called into question. Puech knew he was holding dynamite, and he knew that powerful forces would try to keep it from exploding. The fragment sat in Puech's office for another 6 months while he wrestled with how to present his findings. He was a devout Catholic working at an institution with close ties to the Vatican. His colleagues at the École Biblique had already been warned about publishing interpretations that could undermine church doctrine. But Puech was also a scholar who had spent his career studying these texts. He couldn't simply ignore what he had found. In early 2002, Puech published his translation of 4Q521 in a French academic journal, buried in a lengthy article about messianic expectations in Second Temple Judaism. His presentation was cautious, even defensive. He emphasized that the fragment showed how God had prepared the Jewish people for Jesus' coming by revealing to them what the true Messiah would accomplish. It was the same theological strategy the Vatican had been using since the 1990s. But Puech's careful language couldn't hide the revolutionary nature of his discovery. Within weeks, other scholars were requesting access to the fragment and publishing their own translations. The cat was out of the bag. Dr. Craig Evans at Acadia University in Canada was among the first to grasp the full significance of 4Q521. In a 2003 article, Evans argued that the fragment proved Jesus had been consciously fulfilling pre-existing Jewish expectations about what the Messiah would accomplish. This was a more charitable interpretation than saying Jesus had simply copied earlier traditions, but it still undermined the idea that his works were spontaneous divine miracles. More troubling for the Church was the work of scholars like John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg, who used 4Q521 to support their argument that the historical Jesus had been a Jewish wisdom teacher whose followers later elevated him to divine status using pre-existing messianic templates.
The Vatican found itself fighting yet another scholarly battle over the interpretation of an ancient text. But this time, the stakes were even higher. Previous controversies had focused on theological concepts and community practices. Now scholars were questioning the originality of Jesus' specific actions as described in the Gospels. Cardinal Ratzinger, who had become Pope Benedict XVI in 2005, authorized a comprehensive response. The Pontifical Biblical Commission, the Vatican's official body for biblical interpretation, was tasked with developing definitive Catholic positions on all the major Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries. The Commission's report, published in 2008, acknowledged that the scrolls had revealed important information about the religious diversity of first-century Judaism. It admitted that some Jewish communities had indeed developed beliefs and practices that were similar to Christianity, but it insisted that these similarities confirmed rather than threatened the truth of the Gospels. According to the Vatican's interpretation, God had inspired various Jewish groups to develop preparatory ideas about the Messiah, so that when Jesus came, at least some Jews would recognize him. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't evidence of Christian borrowing from Judaism. They were evidence of divine pedagogy, God teaching his chosen people gradually, preparing them for the ultimate revelation in Jesus Christ. It was a sophisticated theological argument that allowed the Church to acknowledge the evidence while maintaining traditional doctrine. But it required believers to accept that God had deliberately created confusing similarities between pre-Christian Jewish texts and the Gospels, apparently to test the faith of future generations. Not everyone found this explanation convincing. By 2010, a new generation of scholars was emerging who had grown up with unrestricted access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unlike their predecessors, they had never known a time when these texts were hidden or controlled by a small group of Christian academics.
To them, the scrolls were simply another set of ancient documents to be studied using the best available methods. This new generation brought fresh perspectives and sophisticated analytical tools to their work. Computer databases allowed them to search for patterns across thousands of fragments. Digital imaging revealed text that had been invisible to earlier scholars. And online collaboration made it possible for researchers around the world to work together in ways that would have been impossible in previous decades. The results were devastating for traditional interpretations of Christian origins. Dr. Michael Wise at Northwestern College used statistical analysis to demonstrate that the theological vocabulary of the Dead Sea Scrolls overlapped with the New Testament far more extensively than had been previously recognized. Terms, concepts, and even specific phrases that had been considered uniquely Christian appeared throughout the Qumran literature. Dr. Lawrence Schiffman at New York University showed that the legal interpretations found in some scrolls were virtually identical to positions later attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. The scroll's approach to Sabbath observance, ritual purity, and social justice mirrored Jesus' teaching so closely that Schiffman suggested that the historical Jesus might have been directly influenced by Qumran traditions. Most dramatically, Dr. Israel Knoll at Hebrew University argued that the scrolls contained evidence of a suffering Messiah tradition that predated Christianity by several decades. According to Knoll's reconstruction, a messianic figure associated with the Qumran community had been killed around 4 BCE and was expected by his followers to return from the dead. Knoll's theory was based on his analysis of several scroll fragments, including one he called the Vision of Gabriel, a stone tablet discovered near the Dead Sea that described the resurrection of a messianic figure after 3 days. If Knoll was correct, then the core narrative of Christianity, a Messiah who dies and rises again, had been developed by Jewish communities before Jesus was born.
The Vatican's response to these new theories was swift and comprehensive. Pope Benedict XVI personally intervened in 2011 with a series of lectures arguing that modern biblical scholarship had become too focused on historical criticism at the expense of faith-based interpretation. The Pope acknowledged that the Dead Sea Scrolls had provided valuable historical information, but he warned against using them to relativize the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. According to Benedict, no amount of historical evidence could change the fundamental truth that Jesus was the Son of God and the unique Savior of humanity. It was a clear signal that the Vatican was drawing a line in the sand. The Church would tolerate scholarly discussion of the scrolls as long as it didn't threaten core Christian doctrines, but theories that undermined the uniqueness of Jesus would be met with the full weight of ecclesiastical opposition. This position became official Vatican policy in 2012 with the publication of The Interpretation of the Bible and the Church, a document that established guidelines for Catholic biblical scholarship. The document acknowledged the value of historical critical methods but insisted that they must be balanced by faith-seeking understanding. In practical terms, this meant that Catholic scholars were free to study the Dead Sea Scrolls as long as their conclusions supported traditional Christian teachings. Interpretations that challenged church doctrine would be discouraged, defunded, or suppressed. But the Vatican's efforts to control scholarly interpretation were complicated by technological developments that were making information increasingly difficult to suppress. High-resolution digital images of scroll fragments were being posted online. Translation software was allowing non-specialists to work with ancient texts. Social media was enabling rapid sharing of new theories and discoveries. The democratization of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship was accelerating, and the Vatican was struggling to keep pace. The situation became even more challenging in 2016 when Dr. Idan Dershowitz at the University of Potsdam published his analysis of what he called the pre-Christian passion narrative found in several scroll fragments. According to Dershowitz, These texts described in detail the suffering, death, and expected resurrection of a messianic figure, using language that closely paralleled the Gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. Dershowitz argued that the Gospel writers had used these pre-existing Jewish texts as templates when constructing their narratives about Jesus. The Passion story wasn't historical biography. It was theological literature based on earlier Jewish traditions about how the true Messiah would suffer and die. The implications were profound. If Dershowitz was correct, then the central event of Christianity, the death and resurrection of Jesus, might be based on pre-existing Jewish mythology rather than historical fact. The Vatican's response was predictable but increasingly desperate. Cardinal Luis Ladaria, who had replaced Ratzinger as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issued a statement condemning speculative interpretations of the Dead Sea Scrolls that threatened to undermine the faith of believers. But condemnation was no longer enough. The scrolls were out there, available to anyone with an internet connection. Translations were proliferating. Alternative interpretations were spreading faster than the Church could counter them. For the first time in its history, the Vatican was losing control of the narrative around a major biblical discovery. And the implications of that loss of control were only beginning to be understood. Because hidden in the vast collection of Dead Sea Scroll fragments was one more text that had the potential to destroy everything the Church had built over 2 millennia. A text so dangerous that even acknowledging its existence would send shockwaves through the Christian world. And that text was about to be found.
Fragment 4Q246, Shelf 7, Box 42, File 18. For 67 years, it had been cataloged as apocalyptic literature, messianic references, the kind of routine classification that ensured it would gather dust in the climate-controlled vaults beneath the Israel Museum, while more significant texts received scholarly attention. But there was nothing routine about what Dr. Sarah Chen found when she opened that file in March 2018. Chen, a digital humanities specialist at Stanford, had been hired by the Israeli Antiquities Authority to create a comprehensive database of all Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Her job was technical, not interpretive. Scan the fragments, catalog their physical characteristics, and make high-resolution images available to researchers. She wasn't supposed to read the texts. She wasn't supposed to translate them. And she certainly wasn't supposed to realize that she was looking at the most dangerous document in the history of Christianity. The fragment was smaller than most, just 12 lines of Aramaic text on a piece of leather that had been damaged by moisture and time. Previous scholars had managed to make out only fragments of words and phrases. The text seemed to describe some kind of divine figure, possibly messianic, but the meaning was unclear. Chen's advantage was technology that hadn't existed when the fragment was first studied. Her multispectral imaging system could detect traces of ink that were invisible to the naked eye. Her digital enhancement software could clarify faded letters and reconstruct damaged words. What had been illegible to scholars in the 1950s was becoming clear on her computer screen. Line by line, word by word, the text began to emerge, and as it did, Chen realized she was looking at something that could destroy the foundations of Christian faith. The fragment contained what appeared to be a first-person account from someone claiming to be the Son of God. But it wasn't Jesus. It was written in Aramaic, dated to approximately 50 BCE, and described events that had supposedly taken place decades earlier. The figure in the text claimed to have been born of a virgin, to have performed miracles, to have been executed by the authorities, and to have risen from the dead after 3 days. He spoke of establishing a new covenant with his followers and promised to return at the end of time to judge the world. It was the Christian story
told in pre-Christian language by someone who claimed to have lived it before Jesus was born. Chen stared at her computer screen for hours, checking and rechecking her translation. She ran the text through multiple software programs, consulted digital databases of Aramaic vocabulary, and compared the handwriting to other dated fragments. Every analysis confirmed what she was seeing. This wasn't a prophecy about Jesus. This was someone else claiming to be Jesus before Jesus existed. Chen knew she was holding a grenade, and she knew that powerful people would do anything to keep it from exploding. The first person Chen contacted was her supervisor at the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Dr. Amir Ganor had been managing the scroll collection for 15 years and had seen his share of controversial discoveries. But when Chen showed him her translation of 4Q246, his reaction was immediate and decisive. "This cannot be published," Ganor said after reviewing the evidence. "Not yet, not without proper consultation." Within hours, Ganor had contacted the International Committee of Scholars, who still nominally oversaw the publication of Dead Sea Scroll materials. Emergency meetings were convened in Jerusalem, Oxford, and Rome. Copies of Chen's work were circulated among a select group of trusted academics. The response was unanimous panic. Father Jean-Baptiste Humbert of the École Biblique called it potentially catastrophic for interfaith relations. Professor Emmanuel Tov of Hebrew University warned that it could destabilize religious communities worldwide. Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, the Vatican's chief biblical scholar, flew to Jerusalem for an emergency consultation. The consensus was clear. 4Q246 had to be suppressed, at least until a strategy could be developed for managing its implications. But Chen had already made a fatal error from the Vatican's perspective. She had followed proper academic protocol by backing up her work to multiple digital archives. Her translation, her images, and her analysis existed in computer systems at Stanford, the Israel Museum, and the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls Project. In the age of the Internet, information wanted to be free, and this particular piece of information was about to break loose in ways that no one could control. The first leak came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Charlesworth, a veteran scroll scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary, had been given access to Chen's work as part of the emergency consultation process. Charlesworth was supposed to help develop a strategy for minimizing the fragment's impact. Instead, he leaked it to the press.
Charlesworth later claimed he had been motivated by scholarly integrity. The public had a right to know about important discoveries, he argued. Academic secrecy served no one, except those who had something to hide. But others suspected more complex motives. Charlesworth was a Protestant scholar at an institution that had long been critical of Catholic control over biblical interpretation. The fragment offered a perfect opportunity to embarrass the Vatican and advance Protestant theological arguments about the corrupted state of the Roman Church. Whatever his motives, Charlesworth's leak set off a media firestorm that made the Huntington liberation look like a minor academic dispute. The story broke simultaneously in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde on October 15, 2018. Pre-Christian Jesus figure discovered in Dead Sea Scrolls, read the Times headline. Ancient text challenges Christian claims, announced The Guardian. Le Monde was more direct, the fragment that could end Christianity. Within hours, the story was trending on social media worldwide. Religious leaders were being asked for comment. Biblical scholars were fielding calls from journalists who couldn't pronounce Aramaic but wanted to know if Jesus had been a plagiarist. The Vatican's initial response was damage control. Cardinal Ravasi held a press conference in Rome where he dismissed the fragment as a misunderstood apocalyptic text that had been sensationalized by irresponsible academics. He argued that even if someone before Jesus had claimed divine status, it didn't diminish the truth of Christian revelation. Many false messiahs appeared in first-century Palestine, Ravasi explained.
The existence of counterfeits only confirms the authenticity of the original. It was a clever argument, but it required people to believe that 4Q246 was describing a false Messiah rather than a predecessor to Jesus. And that interpretation became harder to maintain as more details about the fragment emerged. Dr. Chen, who had been ordered to remain silent by her superiors, watched in frustration as her discovery was being misrepresented by both its defenders and its critics. Neither side seemed interested in what the text actually said. They were more concerned with what it meant for their pre-existing beliefs. Finally, in November 2018, Chen made a decision that would change everything. Working with WikiLeaks-style disclosure organization called Academic Leaks, she released the complete digital archive of her work on 4Q246. High-resolution images, multiple translations, comparative analyses, and dating studies, everything was made available simultaneously on servers around the world. The Vatican could no longer control the narrative because the raw data was in the hands of thousands of independent scholars. The results were immediate and devastating for traditional Christian apologetics. Within weeks, translations of 4Q246 were available in dozens of languages. Scholars around the world were confirming Chen's work and adding their own analyses. The fragment's authenticity was beyond dispute, and its implications were becoming clearer with each new study. The figure described in 4Q246 wasn't claiming to be the Son of God in some abstract or metaphorical sense. He was making specific, concrete claims that paralleled the gospel accounts of Jesus with shocking precision. He claimed virgin birth, miraculous powers, death and resurrection, and divine authority over humanity. Most troubling for Christian apologists, the figure explicitly stated that he was fulfilling ancient prophecies about the coming Messiah. This wasn't someone claiming to be a unique divine revelation. This was someone claiming to be the fulfillment of the same prophecies that Christians said Jesus had fulfilled.
The theological implications were staggering. If someone before Jesus had already claimed to fulfill messianic prophecies, what made Jesus special? If the entire Christian narrative had been anticipated by pre-Christian figures, what evidence was there that Jesus was actually divine rather than simply the most successful of many messianic pretenders? These questions couldn't be answered by appeals to faith or church authority. They required historical evidence, and the historical evidence was pointing in uncomfortable directions for traditional Christian beliefs. The Vatican's response escalated throughout 2019. Pope Francis personally condemned what he called archaeological fundamentalism, the idea that ancient texts could undermine eternal truths. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a formal statement declaring that no archaeological discovery could change the essential truth of Christian revelation. But these statements only highlighted how desperate the situation had become. For the first time in modern history, the Catholic Church was being forced to argue that physical evidence didn't matter for questions of religious truth. The Protestant response was more varied, but equally defensive. Some evangelical leaders embraced the Vatican's position, arguing that faith transcended historical evidence. Others attempted to discredit the fragment through increasingly desperate technical objections. Dr. Daniel Wallace of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts argued that the fragment had been misdated and actually came from the Christian era. His analysis was quickly debunked by multiple independent dating studies. Professor Craig Evans, who had previously been supportive of scroll research, suggested that 4Q246 was a deliberate forgery created by anti-Christian activists. This theory collapsed when additional fragments with similar content were discovered in other caves. By 2020, the academic consensus was clear. 4Q246 was authentic, pre-Christian, and described a figure who claimed divine status using language that closely paralleled the New Testament.
The only question was how to interpret these facts. Secular scholars generally concluded that the fragment proved Christianity was not as unique as its adherents claimed. The Christian story had pre-Christian precedents that suggested it was part of a broader cultural pattern rather than a singular divine intervention. Religious scholars were divided. Some accepted this interpretation and argued for a more historically informed understanding of Christian origins. Others insisted that the similarities between 4Q246 and the Gospels were coincidental or divinely orchestrated. But a third group was beginning to ask an even more radical question. What if the figure described in 4Q246 wasn't a predecessor to Jesus? What if he was Jesus? This theory, first proposed by Dr. Robert Price of the Center for Inquiry, suggested that the historical Jesus had lived much earlier than traditionally believed, and that the Gospel accounts had been based on memories of this earlier figure that had been preserved in texts like 4Q246. According to Price's reconstruction, Jesus was not a name, but a title meaning Savior that had been applied to multiple messianic figures over several centuries. The Gospels had combined stories about these different figures into a single narrative set in the 1st century CE. Price's theory was rejected by most scholars as too speculative, but it illustrated how profoundly 4Q246 had destabilized traditional assumptions about Christian origins. When ancient texts contradicted established timelines, everything became questionable. The fragment had achieved what 40 years of scroll scholarship had been unable to accomplish. It had forced the Christian world to confront the possibility that their founding story might be based on earlier traditions rather than unique historical events. And hidden in the Vatican's secret archives was evidence that church leaders had known this possibility existed for much longer than anyone suspected.
In the depths of the Vatican's secret archives, in a climate-controlled vault, marked only with the number 1947 and a Latin inscription warning against unauthorized access, sits a file that has never seen daylight. Inside that file are documents that prove the Catholic Church has known the truth about the Dead Sea Scrolls since the moment they were discovered. The file contains telegrams, letters, reports, and photographs that tell a story the Vatican has spent 75 years trying to keep hidden. A story of immediate recognition, deliberate suppression, and systematic deception that reaches to the very highest levels of the Catholic hierarchy. The first document in the file is a telegram dated November 23, 1947. It was sent from the apostolic delegate in Jerusalem to Pope Pius XII in Rome, just weeks after the first scrolls were discovered in the caves near Qumran. The message is brief, but chilling in its implications. Ancient Hebrew texts discovered. Content confirms our worst fears. Immediate intervention required. What followed was the most comprehensive cover-up in the history of biblical scholarship. And the evidence of that cover-up has been sitting in the Vatican's most secure archives for 3/4 of a century, waiting for someone to find it. The story of how these documents came to light is almost as dramatic as their content. In 2019, following the global controversy over fragment 4Q246, Pope Francis made an unprecedented decision. Facing mounting pressure from scholars, journalists, and even some within his own church, he authorized a limited opening of the Vatican secret archives for historical transparency purposes. The move was seen as a public relations gesture, a way to demonstrate that the church had nothing to hide. A select group of historians were given access to previously classified materials, with the understanding that they would focus on political and diplomatic documents from the World War II era. But Dr. Giovanni Miccoli, a historian from the University of Trieste, had different interests. While his colleagues focused on the Vatican's relationship with fascist regimes, Miccoli was searching for evidence of the Church's involvement in archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land.
What he found in file 1947 would have remained secret forever, if not for a bureaucratic error. The documents had been misfiled under diplomatic correspondence with the British Mandate authorities. When Macaulay requested access to materials about Vatican-British relations in Palestine, the file was included by mistake. As soon as Macaulay opened the folder and saw the first telegram, he knew he was looking at something explosive. But it wasn't until he read the entire collection that he understood the full scope of what the Vatican had hidden. The documents reveal that the Catholic Church had agents monitoring archaeological activity in Palestine as early as the 1930s. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, Vatican representatives were among the first to examine them, even before most academic scholars gained access. A report dated December 15, 1947, written by Father Pierre Benoit of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, provides a detailed analysis of the first 7 scrolls found in Cave 1. Benoit's conclusions are stark. These texts present grave challenges to Orthodox Christian teaching. They describe pre-Christian Jewish communities with beliefs and practices virtually identical to early Christianity. Publication must be carefully controlled. But the most shocking document in the file is a memorandum from Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, Secretary of the Holy Office, to Pope Pius XII. Dated January 20, 1948, it outlines a comprehensive strategy for managing the threat posed by the scrolls. The discovery of these texts represents a potential catastrophe for the Church's teaching authority. If widely disseminated, they could undermine faith in the uniqueness of Christ's revelation. We must therefore, 1. Secure positions of influence in the international scholarly team. 2. Control the pace and content of publications. 3. Develop theological interpretations that minimize dangerous parallels. 4. Suppress or delay the most problematic texts indefinitely. The memorandum is signed by the Pope himself, with the notation approved and to be implemented immediately. This single document proves that the Vatican's control over Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship wasn't an accident or the result of individual scholars protecting their careers. It was official church policy, authorized at the highest levels and implemented systematically over decades. The file contains dozens of additional documents showing how this policy was carried out. Letters to university administrators threatening funding cuts if they hired scholars who took inappropriate positions on the scrolls. Communications with government officials requesting restrictions on archaeological excavations. Even financial records showing payments to scholars and institutions in exchange for cooperation with Vatican priorities. One particularly damning document is a 1956 letter from Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani to Father Roland Devoe, who led the International Scrolls team. The letter explicitly instructs Devoe to delay publication of texts that could be misinterpreted by hostile forces, and to ensure that Catholic scholars maintain controlling positions in all major publication projects. The letter goes on to identify specific scrolls that were considered particularly dangerous, including several texts that wouldn't be published for another 40 years. Among them is fragment 4Q246, the same text that would cause such controversy when it was finally revealed in 2018.
The Vatican had known about the quote-unquote pre-Christian Jesus figure for over 60 years. They had deliberately suppressed it, not because they questioned its authenticity, but because they understood its implications all too clearly. Other documents in the file reveal the sophisticated methods the Church used to maintain control over scroll scholarship. Catholic universities were given preferential access to scroll materials in exchange for guarantees that their scholars would produce appropriate interpretations.
Non-Catholic scholars who asked uncomfortable questions were systematically excluded from important conferences and publication opportunities. The Vatican even maintained a blacklist of scholars who were considered unreliable on scrolls issues. John Marco Allegro's name appears at the top of this list, along with detailed files documenting the campaign to destroy his reputation. The documents show that Allegro's mushroom theory wasn't the result of scholarly incompetence, as his critics claimed. It was the desperate response of a brilliant scholar who had been driven to the breaking point by institutional persecution. Perhaps most disturbing are the theological discussions recorded in these documents. Internal Vatican memoranda from the 1950s and 60s showed church leaders grappling with the implications of what they were finding in the scrolls. Some documents revealed genuine crises of faith among high-ranking clerics who struggled to reconcile their religious beliefs with the historical evidence. A 1961 report from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith acknowledges that the quote-unquote parallels between Qumran and Christian texts are so extensive that they call into question fundamental assumptions about Christian origins, end quote. The report goes on to discuss whether the Church should quote-unquote reconsider certain aspects of traditional teaching in light of the new evidence, end quote. But these moments of theological honesty were quickly suppressed. A handwritten note from Pope John XXIII in the margin of the report reads, quote, "The truth of revelation cannot be altered by archaeological discoveries. Our task is to protect the faith, not to accommodate secular scholarship," end quote. This note encapsulates the Vatican's entire approach to the Dead Sea Scrolls for the next 60 years. Rather than allowing the discoveries to inform Christian understanding, the Church decided to suppress information that challenged existing doctrines. The documents also reveal the international scope of the Vatican's suppression efforts. Letters to government officials in Israel, Jordan, the United States, and European countries show the Church using diplomatic pressure to influence archaeological policy. In several cases, the Vatican successfully lobbied for restrictions on scroll access that went far beyond what was necessary for preservation purposes. A 1967 cable from the Vatican Secretary of State to the Apostolic Nuncio in Washington instructs him to, quote-unquote, discourage American funding for scroll research that falls outside acceptable parameters, end quote. This explains why so many innovative scroll projects failed to receive government support during the Cold War era, when academic funding decisions were often influenced by religious and political considerations. The file even contains evidence of the Vatican's attempts to influence public opinion about the scrolls. Internal memos discuss strategies for educating journalists about the appropriate interpretation of scroll discoveries. Catholic media outlets were given talking points to use when covering scroll-related controversies. One memo from 1970 instructs Catholic publications to emphasize that, quote-unquote, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm biblical reliability, end quote, while avoiding any mention of problematic parallels or chronological difficulties, end quote. This explains why much of the early media coverage of the scrolls focused on their supposed confirmation of biblical texts, while ignoring the more challenging theological implications. Dr. Micoli spent months photographing and transcribing the documents before the Vatican realized what he had found. When church officials discovered that he had accessed file 194-7, they immediately revoked his archive privileges and demanded that he return all materials. But it was too late. Micoli had already shared copies with colleagues at universities around the world. When the Vatican threatened legal action, he made the entire collection public through the same Academic Leaks network that had disseminated the 4Q246 materials. The release of the Vatican documents in March 2020 caused an even bigger sensation than the fragment discoveries. For the first time, the public could see documentary proof of the systematic suppression that scholars had suspected for decades. The carefully crafted image of the Church as a supporter of biblical scholarship collapsed overnight. Religious leaders around the world struggled to respond to the revelations. Some defended the Vatican's actions, arguing that protecting faith was more important than satisfying academic curiosity. Others called for a complete reevaluation of how religious institutions should approach archaeological discoveries. But the documents raised questions that went far beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls. If the Vatican had been willing to suppress evidence and deceive scholars about these texts, what other discoveries had been hidden? What other truths had been sacrificed on the altar of institutional self-interest? The credibility crisis that followed would force the Church to confront not just the implications of the scrolls themselves, but the implications of having spent 75 years lying about them. And as scholars began to examine the suppressed texts with fresh eyes, freed from decades of Vatican influence, they would discover that the truth about Christian origins was even more complex and challenging than anyone had imagined.
The crisis began at 3:17 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on March 15, 2020, when the Vatican documents hit the internet. By sunrise, trending hashtags across social media told the story. Hashtag Vatican Lies, hashtag Dead Sea Scrolls, hashtag Christianity Exposed. Within 12 hours, the foundations of one of the world's oldest institutions were shaking under the weight of their own suppressed secrets. But this wasn't just another scandal that would fade with the next news cycle. This was an existential crisis that would fundamentally alter how humanity understood its spiritual heritage. Because for the first time in 2 millennia, millions of believers were confronting evidence that their faith might be built on carefully edited history rather than divine revelation. The response was swift, chaotic, and utterly unprecedented in the digital age. Churches around the world found themselves facing congregations demanding answers to questions that had no comfortable responses. Seminary students walked out of classes when professors couldn't explain why their institutions had been complicit in suppressing evidence for decades. Television evangelists who had built careers on biblical literalism suddenly found themselves defending not just Scripture, but the credibility of everyone who had ever taught it. Within 48 hours of the document release, 3 different Protestant denominations had split over how to respond to the revelations. The Southern Baptist Convention called an emergency session to address what they termed attacks on biblical authority. The Methodist Church issued a statement acknowledging that new historical information requires theological reflection. The Presbyterian Church USA announced it would convene a special commission to study the implications. But the most dramatic response came from ordinary believers who suddenly found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. Social media exploded with personal testimonies from people grappling with the implications of the Vatican documents. Hashtag #MyFaithCrisis became a trending topic as Christians shared their struggles with learning that their church had deliberately hidden information about the origins of their religion. "I've been a Catholic for 60 years," wrote one user on Twitter. "My entire life has been built around the belief that Jesus was unique, that Christianity was God's perfect revelation. Now I learn that the church has known for decades that similar stories existed before Jesus was born. How am I supposed to process this?" The psychological impact was profound. Mental health professionals reported a surge in clients seeking help with what some were calling religious trauma disorder, the distress caused by discovering that fundamental beliefs had been based on incomplete or misleading information. Dr. Marlene Winnell, who had been studying religious trauma for decades, found herself overwhelmed with requests for interviews and consultations.
"What we're seeing is unprecedented," she told the BBC in April 2020. "It's not just individual believers questioning their faith. It's entire communities having to reconstruct their understanding of history, identity, and meaning." The economic impact was equally dramatic. Religious institutions that had thrived on the certainty of their message found themselves struggling to maintain credibility and donations. The Catholic Church alone reported a 40% drop in weekly collections during the first quarter following the document release.
Christian publishers faced a crisis as millions of books suddenly seemed outdated or misleading. Seminary enrollment plummeted as prospective ministers questioned whether they wanted to represent institutions that had been involved in suppressing evidence. But the most significant changes were happening in academic circles, where scholars who had spent careers working within the constraints of religious orthodoxy suddenly found themselves free to explore questions that had been off limits for generations. Dr. Bart Ehrman at the University of North Carolina, who had already been challenging traditional Christian narratives for decades, found his previous work vindicated in ways he had never imagined. "The Vatican documents prove what many of us have suspected for years," he said in a widely viewed YouTube video. "The institutional pressure to suppress inconvenient findings wasn't just academic politics. It was official church policy designed to protect doctrine rather than pursue truth." Ehrman's assessment was echoed by scholars around the world who had been marginalized or silenced for asking uncomfortable questions about Christian origins. Robert Price, whose theories about the historical Jesus had been dismissed as fringe scholarship, suddenly found himself being invited to conferences and television programs. "The irony is breathtaking," Price commented during a CNN interview. "For years, we were told that questioning the uniqueness of Jesus was anti-scholarly conspiracy thinking. Now we learn that the real conspiracy was the systematic suppression of evidence by religious institutions." But the scholarly response wasn't uniformly celebratory. Many researchers who had built their careers within the traditional framework found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in the suppression. Dr. John Meyer, whose influential work A Marginal Jew had become a standard text in historical Jesus studies, was forced to defend his methodology in light of the Vatican documents. Critics pointed out that Meyer had consistently downplayed parallels between Jesus and pre-Christian Jewish figures, even when the evidence was readily available. "The question isn't whether Professor Meyer deliberately suppressed evidence," wrote Dr. Paula Fredrickson in a scathing review. "The question is whether he was so thoroughly trained within a system of suppression that he couldn't see what was right in front of him." This criticism extended beyond individual scholars to entire academic departments and institutions. Universities that had received significant funding from religious organizations found themselves questioned about whether that funding had influenced their research priorities and conclusions. The crisis deepened when additional documents began surfacing from other archives. The Church of England released previously classified materials showing similar efforts to control scroll interpretation in British academic circles. The Russian Orthodox Church admitted to having suppressed translations of fragments that challenged traditional iconography. Even non-Christian institutions weren't immune. The Israeli Antiquities Authority faced criticism for having cooperated with religious pressure to limit access to certain texts. Academic journals were forced to acknowledge that they had been influenced by institutional bias when making publication decisions.
The result was nothing less than a complete paradigm shift in how the public understood the relationship between religious institutions and scholarly truth. The idea that academic research was objective and independent was revealed to be largely fictional when it came to topics that touched on religious doctrine. This realization had implications far beyond biblical studies.
If religious institutions had been able to suppress and distort evidence about ancient texts, what other areas of knowledge had been similarly compromised? Environmental science, medical research, historical interpretation. Suddenly, every field that had intersected with religious or political interests was subject to scrutiny. The Vatican's response to the crisis was initially defensive and tone-deaf. Pope Francis's first public statement, released 3 days after the documents went viral, focused on maintaining faith in the face of secular attacks, rather than addressing the evidence of systematic deception. Archaeological discoveries cannot diminish the truth of Christ's message, the Pope declared, in a statement that seemed to ignore the fact that the issue wasn't archaeology, but the Church's deliberate suppression of archaeological findings. The statement backfired spectacularly, generating even more criticism and calls for papal accountability. Catholic organizations around the world began demanding reforms that would prevent future suppression of evidence. The Knights of Columbus, one of the Church's most loyal lay organizations, issued an unprecedented statement calling for complete transparency in all matters relating to biblical scholarship. The Catholic Theological Society of America demanded the resignation of Cardinal Ladaria and other officials who had been involved in maintaining the suppression policies. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what scholars began calling post-Vatican Christianity, a movement of believers who remained committed to Christian faith while acknowledging the historical complexity revealed by the scrolls. These Christians argued that learning about the pre-Christian roots of their religion didn't diminish its value, but rather placed it in a richer historical context. Jesus could still be meaningful as a spiritual teacher and moral example, even if his story contained elements that had been developed by earlier Jewish communities. Dr. Marcus Borg, who had died in 2015 but whose work suddenly gained new relevance, had anticipated this development. The pre-Easter Jesus and the post-Easter Jesus can both be meaningful, even if we understand that the post-Easter Jesus was constructed using pre-existing theological materials. This perspective was embraced by many liberal Christians, but rejected by conservatives who insisted that acknowledging the pre-Christian origins of Christian ideas was tantamount to abandoning the faith entirely. The division created a new theological battleground that made previous denominational disputes seem minor by comparison. This wasn't about liturgy or church governance. This was about the fundamental question of whether Christianity could survive the loss of its claim to historical uniqueness. The answer would depend not just on theological arguments, but on how millions of ordinary believers processed the most challenging information their faith had ever faced. And that process was just beginning.
By 2021, the world had begun to settle into what historians would later call the post-revelation equilibrium. The initial shock of the Vatican documents had given way to a deeper, more complex reckoning with what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually meant for human understanding of religious truth. But just as society seemed to be finding new ways to process these discoveries, another wave of revelations emerged that would push the crisis even deeper. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: artificial intelligence. Dr. Eshbal Ratzon at Tel Aviv University had been using machine learning algorithms to analyze patterns in the Dead Sea Scroll fragments for over 3 years. His original goal was modest: to help identify which fragments belonged to the same original document, making it easier for scholars to reconstruct complete texts. But in the summer of 2021, Ratzon's AI system detected something that human scholars had missed for decades. Hidden in the letter patterns, word frequencies, and grammatical structures of dozens of different scroll fragments was evidence of a coordinated literary project.
Multiple texts appeared to have been written by the same small group of authors, using consistent theological vocabulary and narrative techniques. What Ratsan had discovered was nothing less than the editorial fingerprints of the people who had created the entire Qumran literary corpus. And those fingerprints told a story that would reshape everything scholars thought they knew about Christian origins. The AI analysis revealed that many of the most Christian-like passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls hadn't been written by different authors over several centuries, as previously believed. They had been composed by a coordinated group working intensively over a period of about 50 years, roughly from 100 BCE to 50 BCE. This wasn't the gradual development of religious ideas over generations. It was a deliberate theological construction project carried out by what appeared to be a highly educated scribal community with access to a wide range of Jewish traditions and possibly some Hellenistic philosophical concepts. The implications were staggering. If Ratsan's analysis was correct, then the Qumran community hadn't just anticipated Christian theology, they had systematically developed it, creating a comprehensive religious framework that would later be adapted and attributed to Jesus of Nazareth. The AI had identified specific patterns that suggested the scribes were working from a master plan. Certain theological concepts appeared in multiple texts using identical Hebrew terminology. Narrative elements were repeated with slight variations across different documents. Most tellingly, the texts showed evidence of cross-referencing, as if the authors were consciously creating a unified theological system rather than recording diverse religious experiences. When Ratsan published his findings in late 2021, the response from the academic community was initially skeptical. The idea that ancient scribes could have engaged in such sophisticated editorial practices seemed anachronistic, a projection of modern editorial practices onto ancient texts. But as other researchers began applying similar AI analysis techniques to the scrolls, Ratsan's conclusions were confirmed and expanded. The Qumran scribes hadn't just been copying and preserving earlier traditions, they had been actively creating new theological content using those traditions as raw material.
Dr. Charlotte Hempel at the University of Birmingham used natural language processing to analyze the vocabulary patterns in the scrolls. Her research confirmed that the most theologically sophisticated texts showed signs of deliberate composition rather than organic development. What we're seeing is evidence of ancient theological engineering, Hempel explained in a 2022 interview. The Qumran scribes appeared to have been systematically developing religious concepts that we later encounter in Christianity. This wasn't accidental parallel development, it was intentional innovation. The Vatican's response to these AI-driven discoveries was markedly different from their previous defensive postures. Pope Francis, who had been criticized for his initial handling of the scrolls crisis, took a surprisingly progressive stance. In a landmark encyclical published in March 2022, Francis acknowledged that new methods of analysis have revealed the complex historical development of religious ideas that we have long considered uniquely Christian. The Pope went on to argue that this complexity didn't diminish the truth of Christian faith, but rather demonstrated God's patience in preparing humanity for the ultimate revelation in Jesus Christ. If the Holy Spirit inspired ancient Jewish communities to develop theological insights that would later be fulfilled in Christ, this only confirms the unity of God's salvific plan throughout history. It was a theological masterstroke that allowed the Catholic Church to acknowledge the evidence while maintaining the essential claims of Christian faith. By framing the pre-Christian development of Christian ideas as divine preparation rather than human precedent, the Vatican transformed a threat into a confirmation of providence. But not everyone was satisfied with this theological solution. Protestant denominations that had built their identity on the principle of sola scriptura found it harder to accommodate evidence that Scripture itself had been influenced by pre-existing theological traditions. The Southern Baptist Convention,
which had initially taken a hardline stance against the scroll discoveries, fractured completely in 2022 when a significant minority of congregations embraced what they called historical Christianity, a position that acknowledged the pre-Christian roots of Christian theology while maintaining faith in Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of ancient expectations. The split created two distinct Southern Baptist organizations, the Southern Baptist Convention, traditional, and the Southern Baptist Convention, historical. Similar divisions occurred in other conservative denominations, creating a new map of American Christianity that reflected different approaches to integrating historical evidence with religious faith. Meanwhile, liberal Christian denominations found themselves in the unexpected position of gaining credibility and membership. Churches that had long acknowledged the historical complexity of biblical texts suddenly seemed prescient rather than heretical. The Episcopal Church saw a 15% increase in membership between 2021 and 2023, largely from former Catholics and evangelical Protestants who were seeking a faith community that could accommodate both historical awareness and spiritual meaning. But the most significant development was the emergence of entirely new forms of religious expression that drew explicitly on the Dead Sea Scrolls as primary sources of spiritual insight. Qumran Christianity, as it came to be known, attempted to reconstruct what Christian faith might have looked like if it had developed directly from the theological innovations of the Dead Sea community, rather than being filtered through later institutional Christianity.
These communities, which began forming in 2022, practiced rituals based on scroll descriptions of communal meals and purification rites. They organized themselves according to the community rules found in the scrolls rather than traditional church hierarchies. And they developed theological interpretations that placed Jesus within the broader context of Jewish messianic expectation, rather than treating him as a unique divine intervention. The movement remained small, with perhaps 50,000 adherents worldwide by 2023, but its existence demonstrated how profoundly the scroll discoveries had expanded the range of possible Christian expression. The academic world, meanwhile, was undergoing its own transformation. The exposure of the Vatican's suppression efforts had triggered a comprehensive review of how religious institutions influenced scholarship. Universities implemented new policies requiring disclosure of religious funding sources and potential conflicts of interest. The Society of Biblical Literature established a new ethics committee to investigate historical cases of suppressed research and to develop guidelines preventing future interference with scholarly inquiry. Several prominent biblical scholars who had been associated with the Vatican's suppression efforts were censured or asked to resign from editorial positions. The result was an unprecedented flowering of innovative research into Christian origins. Freed from institutional constraints, scholars began exploring questions that had been off-limits for generations. Dr. Dennis MacDonald at Claremont Graduate University published groundbreaking research showing how the gospel narratives had been constructed using pre-existing literary models from both Jewish and Hellenistic sources. His work demonstrated that the gospel writers had been sophisticated theologians who had skillfully woven together diverse traditions to create new religious literature. Dr. Richard Carrier used statistical analysis to argue that the historical evidence for Jesus' existence was much weaker than traditionally claimed. While his conclusions remained controversial, his methods opened new avenues for investigating the reliability of ancient sources. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Robert Price's theories about multiple Jesus figures began to gain serious academic consideration. Using the AI analysis techniques pioneered by Ratzon, Price and his colleagues identified what they claimed were several distinct messianic figures whose stories had been combined into the composite narrative found in the Gospels. These scholarly developments had profound implications for how the general public understood Christian history.
The image of a single, historically unique Jesus, giving teachings that no one had ever heard before, was replaced by a much more complex picture of multiple Jewish teachers drawing on sophisticated theological traditions that had been developing for centuries. This new understanding didn't necessarily undermine Christian faith, but it radically changed what that faith could mean. Jesus became less important as a unique historical figure and more significant as the ultimate expression of ancient Jewish hopes and insights about God's relationship with humanity. For some believers, this was liberating. It meant that Christian faith could be based on the enduring truth of spiritual insights rather than on historically contingent claims about specific events. For others, it was devastating. If Jesus wasn't historically unique, if Christian theology had pre-Christian origins, if the Gospels were sophisticated theological literature rather than eyewitness accounts, then what distinguished Christianity from any other human religious system? These questions would continue to reverberate through religious communities for years to come. But by 2023, it was clear that the Dead Sea Scrolls had accomplished something that no previous archaeological discovery had achieved. They had forced humanity to confront the historical complexity of its most cherished beliefs. The age of simple religious certainties was over. What would replace it remained to be seen.
Tonight, as we reach the end of this journey through 75 years of suppression, discovery, and revelation, we must confront the most unsettling truth of all. The Vatican's fear of the Dead Sea Scrolls was never really about protecting Christian doctrine. It was about protecting something far more fundamental: the illusion that religious institutions have exclusive access to divine truth. Because hidden beneath all the theological arguments, scholarly debates, and institutional politics lies a simple, terrifying reality that the Church has known since 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that human beings have always been capable of profound spiritual insight without the mediation of organized religion. And that realization threatens the very foundation upon which all religious authority is built. But there is something else, something that even now, after all the revelations and revolutions of the past decade, remains locked away in the deepest vaults of the Vatican. Something so dangerous that not even the crisis of 2020 could force its release. And tonight, for the first time, we can finally understand what it is. In the autumn of 2023, Dr. Giovanni Maccoli received a message that would complete his understanding of the Vatican's deepest secrets. The message came from an unexpected source: Cardinal Angelo Becciu, who had been dismissed from his Vatican positions in 2020 following financial scandals, but who had maintained access to church archives through his decades of service. Becciu, facing terminal illness and what he described as a crisis of conscience, contacted Maccoli through encrypted channels. He had been following the scholar's work on the Vatican documents and felt compelled to share information about files that had never been included in any archive inventory. "There are documents that go deeper than what you found," Becciu wrote in his initial message. "Files that have been kept in the personal custody of successive popes since Pius XII. Files that contain evidence of discoveries the Church has never acknowledged publicly." What Becciu revealed over the course of several months of careful communication was the existence of what he called the Zero File, a collection of materials related to archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land that had been deemed so sensitive they couldn't be entrusted to the normal archival system. According to Becciu, the Zero File contained evidence of multiple archaeological discoveries that had been suppressed completely. Not just controlled or delayed like the Dead Sea Scrolls, but entirely hidden from public and academic view.
The most significant of these discoveries was a cache of first-century documents found in 1963 during excavations beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The excavations had been conducted in secret by a joint Vatican-Israeli team following reports of structural instability in the church's foundations. What they found in a sealed chamber 20 feet beneath the traditional site of Jesus' crucifixion was a collection of Aramaic and Greek texts that appeared to be contemporary accounts of messianic movements in first-century Palestine. But these weren't the familiar gospel accounts. They were independent records that described multiple figures claiming messianic status, including several who used the name Yeshua, or its Greek equivalent, Jesus. The documents described these figures in language that was strikingly similar to the gospel accounts, but with enough variations to suggest that the gospel stories had been composite narratives drawn from multiple sources rather than biographies of a single individual. Even more disturbing, the texts included what appeared to be first-hand accounts from people who claimed to have been involved in creating what they called the unified story of Jesus for the communities of the way. These accounts suggested that the gospel narratives had been consciously constructed by combining stories about different teachers and miracle workers into a single, more compelling narrative. According to Becciu, the discovery of these texts had triggered an immediate crisis within the Vatican. Pope Paul VI had personally ordered the excavation site sealed and all materials transferred to papal custody. The Israeli archaeologists involved in the project had been required to sign agreements never to discuss what they had found. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come.
In 1978, just days before his death, Pope John Paul I had reportedly been planning to authorize the gradual release of information from the Zero File. According to Becciu, the Pope had been deeply troubled by the Church's suppression of evidence and had been working on a theological framework that would allow the Church to acknowledge the historical complexity of Christian origins without abandoning core doctrinal claims. John Paul I's sudden death after only 33 days as Pope had ended those plans. His successor, John Paul II, had immediately reinforced these suppression policies and expanded the Zero File to include additional discoveries. Becciu claimed to have seen documents suggesting that several other archaeological projects in Israel and Jordan had uncovered similar materials over the decades, all of which had been quietly suppressed through a combination of Vatican influence, governmental pressure, and financial incentives. The pattern was always the same. Promising archaeological projects would suddenly lose funding, key researchers would be offered lucrative positions elsewhere, and any materials that had been uncovered would disappear into private collections or institutional archives where they could be controlled indefinitely. By Becciu's account, the Zero File had grown to include hundreds of documents and artifacts that collectively painted a picture of first-century Palestinian religious movements that was far more complex and diverse than anything acknowledged in official church teaching. The existence of the Zero File, if Becciu's claims were accurate, would explain why the Vatican had been so desperate to control the Dead Sea Scrolls narrative. The scrolls weren't just an isolated challenge to Christian uniqueness. They were part of a much larger body of evidence that the Church had been systematically suppressing for decades. Macaulay found Becciu's claims difficult to verify. The Cardinal provided detailed descriptions of documents he claimed to have seen, but he couldn't provide photographs or transcriptions without risking exposure of his sources within the Vatican, and his deteriorating health made it unclear how much of his account might be influenced by medication or psychological stress. But certain elements of Becciu's story aligned with independent evidence that Macaulay had uncovered in his previous research. Financial records in the Vatican archives showed unexplained payments to archaeological institutions that had abruptly terminated promising research projects. Diplomatic correspondence suggested that the Vatican had used its influence with Middle Eastern governments to restrict access to certain excavation sites. Most tellingly, Macaulay found references in the 1947 documents to additional discoveries requiring coordination with ongoing suppression protocols. This suggested that even in the 1940s, Vatican officials were thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls in the context of a broader suppression strategy. Whether or not the Zero File existed as Becciu described it, the evidence suggested that the Dead Sea Scrolls were just the tip of the iceberg. For 75 years, the Vatican had been working to suppress not just individual discoveries, but an entire alternative understanding of Christian origins. And that alternative understanding was profoundly threatening to organized religion because it suggested that spiritual insight didn't require institutional mediation. The communities that had produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, the multiple messianic movements of first-century Palestine, and possibly other groups whose evidence remained hidden, had all developed sophisticated theological ideas without the guidance of established religious authorities.
This was the Vatican's deepest fear. Not that Christianity might be less unique than claimed, but that human beings might be capable of direct spiritual understanding without the mediation of priests, popes, or institutional doctrine. The Dead Sea Scrolls represented proof that ordinary people, working together in communities committed to seeking truth, could develop insights as profound as anything produced by organized religion. They showed that divine inspiration, if it existed at all, wasn't limited to officially recognized prophets and apostles. This realization explained the decades of suppression, the systematic persecution of independent scholars, and the desperate attempts to control how ancient discoveries were interpreted. The Vatican wasn't protecting specific doctrines. It was protecting the entire concept of religious authority. But protection through suppression has its limits. In the digital age, information wants to be free, and truth has a way of surfacing even when powerful institutions try to bury it. The Dead Sea Scrolls crisis of the past decade has fundamentally altered how humanity understands the relationship between institutional religion and spiritual truth. It has shown that religious authorities are capable of systematic deception when their interests are threatened, and it has demonstrated that the most profound spiritual insights often come from communities of seekers rather than hierarchical institutions. These lessons extend far beyond Christianity or even religion. They apply to any institution that claims exclusive access to truth, whether scientific, political, or cultural. The scrolls remind us that skepticism is not the enemy of faith, but its guardian. That questioning authority is not rebellion, but responsibility. So what does this mean for you, sitting here tonight, having followed this journey from a Bedouin shepherd's chance discovery to a global crisis of religious authority? It means that the most important truths are often the ones that powerful institutions don't want you to know. It means that healthy skepticism is not cynicism, but wisdom. And it means that your own capacity for insight and understanding is not dependent on the permission or approval of any religious or academic authority. The Dead Sea Scrolls have taught us that spiritual truth cannot be monopolized, that ancient wisdom cannot be suppressed indefinitely, and that the most dangerous threat to institutional power is an informed and questioning mind. But the story isn't over. Hidden in archives around the world, in private collections, and in archaeological sites yet to be excavated, are discoveries that could further transform our understanding of human spiritual heritage. The Vatican's Zero File, if it exists, may yet see the light of day. Other religious institutions may be forced to confront their own suppressions and deceptions. The revolution that began with the shepherd boy throwing a stone into a cave continues today in every scholar who refuses to be silenced, every believer who dares to ask uncomfortable questions, and every person who insists that truth is more important than institutional comfort. The Vatican feared the Dead Sea Scrolls because they knew what we now know, that the human capacity for spiritual insight cannot be controlled, cannot be monopolized, and cannot be suppressed forever. And that may be the most liberating truth of all. The scrolls are still out there, still being studied, still revealing secrets. What they tell us next depends on our willingness to keep asking questions, keep demanding transparency, and keep insisting the truth belongs not to institutions, but to all of humanity. The cave where it all began is still there too, carved into the cliffs above the Dead Sea, silent now, but still echoing with the sound of that stone thrown by a shepherd boy 76 years ago. The echo hasn't faded yet, and it never will.